So welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. Tonight we're doing chapters 23 and 24 from volume 2 of The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And these chapters are on emptiness, shunyata, and related subjects. I still have some people arriving. Okay. Let's start by taking a good posture and bringing our minds out of thought and into awareness of this present time and place. Our awareness is clear, effortless, and in this awareness there arise and pass away from moment to moment sights, sounds like these words. Now that I mention it, bodily sensations. Unless you've been doing some cooking, probably know what smells or tastes, but who knows? Might be. And the occasional mental event. And the point is that these things are arising and passing away now. The Buddhist teachings say that the only real time is this time, now. All the rest, past and future, are fabrications, stories, dramas created out of who knows what, just like the things you see on television. They're fictions about the past and the future, that's what we call them. We think that they're real when we tell ourselves about them, but they're not. They're stories created out of concepts and memories and very partial memories and concepts out of our habits. This moment right now is the only time that is real. All the rest is dream. And this path is about coming into this present moment now and beginning to live in it effortlessly. There's a kind of surrender, you might say, to this present moment, to this time. Our dreams of the past and the future that we impose on our experience are always purposeful. They have to do with judgments, directions, plans, things we want to avoid again or cultivate again, hopes and fears. And when we come into this present moment, we have to surrender all that. And we become like people on a raft in the middle of the ocean, drifting, seeing whatever comes up next. It might be a storm, it might be a sea monster, it might be a big fish, it might be a wave, it might be some other people on the raft. All kinds of things. But we're not in control. Well, we are in a way. We can choose to do what we're going to do in the moment, but we have no real control over our future. Our past is just a myth, a story that we've created, very, very partial and incomplete out of the vast range of experience that we had in those present moments. I mean, look, so rich. And so we're being enjoined by these teachings to come present. These chapters that we're going to go through tonight are descriptions of this present moment. So bring your mind right here, rest without any purpose, no direction, just awareness of whatever it is. The screen in front of you, the sound of this voice, the feeling of your bottom on your chair or cushion, whatever you're sitting on. All of this so immediate and effortless. So, this chapter is about reality. Both these chapters, which is described in two terms that we're going to be going through tonight: relative truth and absolute truth. These are the two terms which are subsumed under the heading emptiness, shunyata. When we speak of it being empty, reality, being empty, what's it empty of? It's empty of concept. It's empty of the stories about the past and the future. It's what it is, ta-ta-ta, as it is, this. Tathagata, the essence of as it is. This is what shunyata is. It's empty of mistakes. It's empty of error. It's empty of concept altogether. Because concepts are so partial. They're just like tags, names that we write on a piece of paper and we stick to something. And shunyata is the something, absent those tags. So we bring our minds here into this present moment, and we see this reality, absent those tags, and it has a number of qualities. One is that in this moment, there are many things. There's these words, they're individual, they rise and pass away. There's this sweater that you might be looking at now that somebody put the spotlight on me. There are all the things that you can experience through the five senses and your mind. And these are called the relative truth. Trungpa Rinpoche likes the Yogacaran explanation of relative truth, which divides it into two parts, two different versions. The main version, the true version, is that this sweater is different than this shirt. This word is different than the next word. All these things that arise and pass away have their different qualities. This is, you might say, the true version of relative truth, according to the Yogacara school of Buddhism, which arose in the 6th century AD. Its main proponents were Asanga and his brother Vasubandhu. 6th century, right, Michael? Later than the Madhyamika. So our experience is made up of all these different things, you might call them. Do you know who Mike is? I think we better not admit Mike. The second aspect of the relative truth is that we attach labels to these things. We say, oh, he's getting old. Aha. And there are all kinds of meanings and feelings attached to those words. Or we say, gee, I like the color of my sweater. Mine happens to be black. What the heck? Or we say, I don't like the taste of this drink, which happens to be just water, and I actually do like it. These labels that we put on the relative truth, there's the relative truth of the drink, which actually exists, and then there's the feeling or judgment about it. There's the relative truth of this sweater, which actually exists, and then there is the label, the judgment that we put on it in concepts, all kinds of concepts. So in the Yogacara scheme, these have two different names. The real relative truth, meaning the more trustworthy relative truth, is called the Paratantra. And the unworthy, the unreliable relative truth is called Parikalpita. And Parikalpita is a lie. It's an illusion. It's a myth. Paratantra is pointing to experiences that seem to be appearing, like the sweater, these words, all that stuff. That's part of the real relative truth. So our world is made up of all of these events, the objects of the five senses as they appear in the moment. Shall we let Mike in and see if we know him? Okay. You're doing it, Anna, Michael. The real relative truth. All the events, experiences of the five senses and mind as they arise now. They're real. The illusory relative truth is all of these things with the judgments, the concepts that we put on them. I'm going to point out to you, I can see it. I had a tooth pulled. So I'm just explaining why you're seeing a missing tooth in my mouth. They got to put a bridge in a couple of weeks. This is relative truth. I'm embarrassed about it. That's the Parikapita. The fact of it, that there's a tooth missing and a hole there, is the Paratantra, the real relative truth. Now, all of these relative truths, the real ones, with their baggage of unreal concepts, arise and pass away now. It's happening. This hand moves across the screen and it's gone. These words come out of my mouth and they're gone. The sensation of your bottom on your seat is there because I've just, pointed it out to you, and in a moment it'll be gone. Someone's asking, is your missing tooth absolute? It's relative. It's a relative truth and missing tooth. But the fact that all of this stuff has no real substance, is constantly appearing and disappearing, that is the absolute truth. That is the truth of emptiness. That nothing really exists. I used to go to teachings before COVID. Now we do it online. And sometimes in the chants there's this line, things appear, and yet they do not exist. They do not exist, and yet they appear. That's it. This is the absolute truth. This constant disappearing, that nothing has any true substance. This is the real meaning of shunyata, emptiness. That in now, remember it's now is the only time we ever have. It's the only time that is real. We're being enjoined to live in it. When we start studying in 2 weeks We're going to be studying PToD Rinpoche, the words of my perfect teacher. I also recommend to you a book. I can never remember the name of the author. He's French. Somebody, Michael, do you remember his name? I'm talking about Enlightened Vagabond by the Frenchman who was a scientist, and then he became a monk, and then
Matthew Ricard.
I'm sorry, Matthew Ricard. Thank you. Thank you, Mathieu Ricard. I always think Fabrice Midal. He's another Frenchman, or with a French name anyhow. He did another book. Yeah, Mathieu Ricard. He wrote another book called Enlightened Vagabond. Thank you, Valerie. She's putting it in chat. It's wonderful. Enlightened Vagabond is a total hoot. It's the kind of thing you read for entertainment. Truly. It's all these stories about one of the great characters of Tibetan Buddhism, PToD Rinpoche, who wrote the words of my perfect teacher, but whose life he lived totally in the moment, in the present, without care. An example of just letting it all hang loose, you might say. Brilliant life. Utterly crazy. Wait till you read some of the stories if you haven't already. They are fun. This is a fun book. The Words of My Perfect Teacher is a serious book, and we're going to work our way through it. It's very doctrinal, and it's very, very traditional, and you're going to learn a lot reading it. I've been reading it in preparation, and I'm learning a lot. Indeed. It's making you realize the extent to which you haven't taken advantage, full advantage of the Dharma. So, where are my glasses? Here we go. The first part of this chapter is called Dropping Conceptual Fixations. He says, relative reality is not particularly workable, wise, or inspiring. This is the reality of the Parikapita he's talking about, that all conceptualized. He says, in fact, really, Kunzup, he's talking about Kunzup. Kunzup is the Tibetan for relative truth, relative reality. It means outfit. It's like everything is clothed in an outfit, like a sweater, or words have a quality to them of love and hate, good and bad, and so forth, and all that. That's what Kunzup refers to. This is relative truth. He says, because there's no ground to be fixated on, nothing actually happens. We think things happen, but they're all just passing away. I mean, this gesture, do you remember it after it's gone? No. We only really live now, in this present moment. What we're fixating on remains vague. We have no working basis. So Rinpoche discusses the disconnect between the thing and the thing named. That the thing named implies some kind of ongoing existence, reality, a real thing, and it isn't there. It's just this appearance, like the image on your screen. He says there is no possessor of such a situation. It's just happening. It's complete, non-existent. It has no fundamental existence. So we take our fixation off things as they are, and we begin to plant a seed in our minds known as Buddha nature, coming into this present moment, appreciating this constant display, being part of it. This is our Buddha nature. This is what it means to be Buddha. It's never ending. And if it does end, who's there to know it? Without fixation, things are seen as they are, this way, without any judgment to them, without any coloring of our minds. There is some kind of intelligence taking place. Things are seen to be both colorful and empty of conceptualization. So when we come into this conceptless, present moment of the five senses in mind, this constant display. Everything, because it's stripped of the idea of past and future, the regrets and fears of the past and the hopes and fears of the future, because it's stripped of that, everything appears much more vividly. It's not only empty of concept, it's colorful, much more colorful. And we can experience this. We do this all the time. And there are moments in our days when suddenly we're impressed by that sound of the bird, that hummingbird at the feeder, and we go, oh, look at that. Or whatever it might be. The quality of the clouds in the sky. Who knows? A beautiful sound. A really amazing aroma. It could be terrible, but it really hits us. This is the vividness of the phenomenal world, of the relative truth, the paratantra, the real relative truth, as it arises in the present moment. So we don't use anything else to see shunyata. Really, we're throwing out all of our mechanics, all of our tools, because seeing shunyata, truth, remember, this is absolute truth. This is the way things really are. Must be direct. Now, this. If you get dizzy trying to figure it out, you might come to some kind of sense, he says. You can let go of all your concepts. This trick is used by Madhyamikans and in Rinzai Zen, the use of koans. It kind of stops your mind. That's what koans are for. The most famous koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And you try and figure that out, and your mind stops. Any kind of logical ratiocination. He says the idea is that logic chases its own tail and eventually blows up, revealing what? Shunyata. Truth. This world. So these words, the word for relative truth I've already given you is kunzup, means the outfit of everything. Kun is all, and zup is outfit. And dundam. Dundam means absolute truth. Dam is truth, and dun means without compromise. In dundam, absolute truth is the perception of shunyata, emptiness, empty of any kind of error, which is reality. And we're not talking about meditative absorptions, he makes this clear, which are the God realms, like getting, fixated on an object of meditation, a mantra, whatever it might be, so that you become sort of blissfully concentrated in a trance state. It's not about that. It's about rediscovering yourself in the world through the inspiration of Buddha nature, he says. We're coming back to our true being. Haltingly, perhaps. Each one of us is different. I shouldn't say that. Each one of us has a different path, faster, slower. Remember, your biggest enemy on this path is self-doubt, self-criticism. Let it go. So we have to work up to dundam, absolute truth, first with pure relative truth. That means relative truth that is just things seen as they are without the labels. That's the first step. And then we begin to realize that what we're seeing is constantly passing away and reappearing, and it's just a constant change, just like this hand moving across this screen, just like the television shows we watch on our TVs, just like life, a constant and ever-changing display. So the activities of the Bodhisattva are based on skillful means and wisdom working side by side, like the two wings of the bird. Skillful means is kunza, relative truth. And wisdom is dundam, absolute truth. Madhyamika style, he says. Madhyamika style means that it just eliminates any kind of concretizing of it. You can't concretize this. It's just a passing, constant change. Things appear, but they don't exist. They exist, don't exist, and yet they appear. This is a description of reality. So he says each experience of truth, when we do study this and experience it and come back to it, leaves a footprint which must be shed. The footprint is, oh, that's shunyata. I just had an experience of shunyata. And that's a trace. That's like a concretizing of your experience. And in fact, it's sort of a backward step, or it's a pause. As we go along the path, there are constant footprints. The footprints are saying, oh, here's where I am. Now I'm doing this. I. And these become lighter and lighter until the attainment of the Vajra-like samadhi. That's enlightenment itself. When you let go of all idea of progress on the path. So it's necessary to realize that all this does not happen in one sudden flash, but is a slow thinning out process. We begin to realize it. We come back, we appreciate the quality of the day, the transience of this moment. We come back into the present. We let go of our hopes and fears. We let go of our resentments. That's a good one. Our enemies, because those are just more sticky concepts, you might say. So we use concepts to go beyond concept, which are all the things, words that are coming out of this mouth. And we go beyond concept to shunyata. And then he says this, that the connection between absolute and relative truth is compassion. And what that means is that as we begin to appreciate the absolute truth, that none of this has any true existence, it's a constant arising and passing, that it appears so vividly, so beautifully, that it touches us. It moves us with love. It's like that passage that we chant every day in the lineage chant. How's it go? The Dharmakaya. Nothing whatever, but everything arises from it. Nothing whatever, but everything arises from it. This is what it's talking about. The relative truth arising from the Dharmakaya, which is the absolute truth. Nothing whatever, but everything appears. So samsara is distorting and conceptualizing the relative truth. This is what samsara is, what suffering is. Making love, taking a shower, drinking a cup of tea, all of this is random labeling, which is called in Tibetan, and he talks about this, kuntak. It is the parikapita of the Yogacharans. Kun here means random, rather than all, which is what he often means. And takpa is labeling or pigeonholing. This is the foundation of samsara, random labeling and pigeonholing. We don't know what we're doing. We are always trying to latch onto situations. Kuntak covers both the ego of dharmas and the ego of individuals. It's mistaken ideas. It is that which makes us hang on to things, to ourselves or to the world. That is what we do in the samsaric world. We apply kuntak, concepts, by attaching ourselves to a certain idea, and then we try to perpetuate it so that the world will appear the way we want it. It's a form of fixation. It's mercenary and opportunistic. It's very selfish and self-aggrandizing. He says you randomly pick something and then you fixate. It also has to do with hatred, the object of your hatred, that you want to get rid of something in your world. That's kuntak. With kuntak, your reactions to things are just a fabrication of so-called reality rather than actual reality. There are stories. The point is that anything that goes on within the level of kuntak is not really going on at all. It is pure fabrication, just a big scheme in your head to try to occupy ourselves for no reason. It keeps us busy. It keeps our ego, I, the myth of I, alive. It gives it a job. It gives it an occupation to tell the story and to act it out even. It is a big deception. It's suffering, dukkha. You're reacting to your fabrications, your kuntak. Shunyata means being free of all of these kinds of fabrications. Kuntak, being free of it. Getting involved and lost in these fabrications, none of it is real. And this is how we get confused and split off from our Buddha nature, the Tathagata. And it's how we separate ourselves from others, from the world, from parts of the world. You and your wakefulness have different opinions altogether. It is very important to understand how the whole thing goes wrong. And that split between I and other, me and my judgments of other, is not a once upon a time story. It's happening all the time in our everyday lives. When you remove the stupidity and aggression of kuntak, labeling, judging, softness and gentleness remain. The beauty of this world as it is. Things that you hated. At core, they're soft and gentle. That softness is known as shunyata, emptiness, and compassion. Shunyata means going beyond kuntak, transcending it. You only need to discover your kuntak to understand how it works in order to see that it is no longer real and that it is a form of self-torture. It's a way to be untrue. It's a way to be criminal. The judgments, these habitual judgments. When you understand kuntak, this labeling, you realize that territory and aggression are not real. They're fabrications, temporary, conceptual, lies. When you transcend samsara and kuntak, you can live your life much better. He says, the idea that giving up samsara means leaving behind the pragmatic world, the world of practicality, is absolutely ludicrous and does not correspond in the least to the Buddha Dharma. Giving up kuntak, we live our lives not only with compassion and appreciation and in greater enjoyment, but much more effectively. You do what needs to be done instead of what kuntak is telling you to do, which is always a perversion and is very, very repetitive. We're not talking about abandoning the world. With true kunzap, we should keep up with the demands of the world purely and properly. With true kunzap, relative truth, not kuntak. Kuntak keeps us immersed in illusion and error. So there are 4 ways to expose kuntak. One is we examine the cause. Does it come from yourself or others? And you can't find it. It just seems to appear. As if you ask, where in myself does it come from? These false concepts. You won't find anywhere in yourself that the concept comes from. It just seems to appear. So you think it must come from others. But those others also come from you. Your judgment of them. Your feeling of separateness. And then finally, you say, it doesn't seem to come from either one, so a cause doesn't seem to exist for this kuntak. You can't find what causes it. The point of examining the cause is that the root of kuntak cannot be found. It just appears and disappears. But we can. What's the word? Reject it. Avoid it. Throw it out. It doesn't come from anywhere, kuntak. This false conceptualization, judgment. It's not your fault, nor is it the fault of others. In fact, it doesn't really exist. Just like these words, they're gone in a moment. What remains is the ongoing consciousness in this present moment. The teachings say that eternity doesn't exist except in this present moment. This is the Buddhist version of eternity. You can examine the effect. He says, if we are constantly imagining, anticipating the fruition of our acts, I mean, it really never happens. Or if it happens very real and different than we anticipated it. And you can examine both the cause and effect, and you can examine the nature of the whole thing. And what you find is that nothing has actually happened. Because kuntak, concept, evaporates as it happens. It's gone. The cause and the effect of your panic are insubstantial. They don't exist. You've just made them up. And we are constantly making up the causes and the effects of our panics and fears, our hatreds, our attempts to self-aggrandize and self-promote. And then they're gone. You'll see, finally, examining the nature of the whole thing, how you build castles on ice. This is what kuntak is. It's a castle on ice, a concept. Your role as samsaric gentleman or lady or powerful person is fundamentally full of holes. In fact, the very idea of having a role is full of holes. So I'm going to stop there and turn this over to Michael, this profound subject.
Thank you, John. I am going to switch to gallery view so I can see everyone, and we'll begin. So the chapter that I'm going to be talking about is titled Awakening Unfabricated Perception. And of the chapters that we've read on this entire section in the book on emptiness, this is probably the most fruitional. But before we start talking about the chapter, I wanted to say a few things about just the path aspect, I guess you could say, of how we go about working with or trying to develop some understanding of shunyata. The problem that we have is, on the one hand, shunyata and absolute truth really can't be defined or captured in any way by conceptual mind. Yet we have to approach or begin with where we are. And where we are is working with conceptual mind. we can easily say everything is empty, but that's pretty meaningless if there's no experience, if we don't have some experience of that. So I went back through the chapters in this section of the book, and I just wanted to highlight a few things that Trungpa Rinpoche says that I think really get at more of how we might actually work with this in terms of practice. And the first is, he talks about the progression of beginning with shamatha meditation, and how out of shamatha we develop vipassana, and through vipassana we develop prajna, and then it's prajna that actually sees shunyata. So shamatha is necessary because ordinarily, as we read in the chapter that we read from Tulku Ujin's As It Is on shamatha vipassana, the reason that we need to practice shamatha is that most of us are in the habit, as he put it, of following thought after thought. So that there's constant agitation, constant turmoil, constant hopes and fears, and all of this obscures the clarity of our fundamental awareness. As we practice shamatha, and we do so by, as we say every day, letting go of effort, just resting, doing our best to rest in present awareness, and when we find ourselves distracted, come back. As we do that, we come to realize that what at first might seem as if we're dealing with wall-to-wall, carpet-to-carpet thoughts, that actually thoughts come and go, and that there are actually gaps at times in our thoughts, that there are gaps between thoughts, and that every now and then we're able to just settle. And as we practice and really develop a regular practice, this occurs more and more to us, not because we make the effort, but because we relax effort altogether. We relax trying to create any particular state of mind, which again creates struggle. And we come to recognize these gaps. Recognizing the gaps, recognizing these moments of just awake, present awareness, that's the beginning of Vipassana experience. Vipassana has that quality of knowing, or clear seeing, superior seeing, where we're able to, at least for moments in the beginning, and as we go along for longer and longer moments, just be able to rest in seeing things as they are, without being swayed one way or another, without accepting, rejecting, struggling, all of the things that we ordinarily do. And out of that Vipassana experience, we develop prajna. And it's prajna, clear seeing of prajna, that ultimately lets us see shunyata, the emptiness of things. Trungpa Rinpoche, often in talking about vipassana and prajna both, talks about developing inquisitiveness, the ability or our willingness to look further or look into. And actually, if you go back through these chapters, you'll see different places where he says exactly that. And some of the things that he has us look further or look into are, for instance, he talks about situations of contrast. If you remember, there was one chapter where he talked about having invited people over and they don't come, and we're expecting them, and we start developing all kinds of ideas about why they didn't show up. But he says if we actually just let go, and just let go of the expectation, we come to recognize something about emptiness, that there's this points where we can actually recognize that we're caught up in expectation, preconception, and thought. And again, we can just let go. He talks about in a different chapter about situation where somebody takes your ice cream or takes your boyfriend or girlfriend. And again, it's a heavy sense of expectation and then disappointment or contrast. Mainly it's contrast. And we begin to see that how we thought the world would be is not how the world is. And that these moments, these are experiences of shunyata and post-meditation, but in a sense it's the same thing. We're again looking at gaps, openings in our ordinary, just chugging along sense of habituation and expectation and preconception. He talked about looking at kunzup, looking at this all-covered world, and coming to realize that we each have our own individual way of looking at the world. If you remember, there's a chapter when he says, how do we know what I call red is what you call red, or what you call blue is what I call blue. Well, there has to be some commonality in some way, because most of us stop at red lights, although if you drive in Connecticut, you might doubt that. But you're supposed to anyway. But the point is that, like, this commonality is also just a relative truth. It's one of the interesting things that people experience when they travel and go to different countries and begin to just rub up against a different culture. You realize that it's not fixed or inherent in things, that it's a matter of relative truth, that it's based on causes and conditions. And so we begin to let go of our sense slowly of substance being in things, that there's some unchanging or permanent, singular as opposed to multiple, and independent as opposed to depending on causes and conditions. That's where we begin to actually see something of what it is that emptiness means. We begin to see that there are situations that seem solid because we see them that way. But more and more we realize that things aren't so fixed. That, as John was saying, things are in the process of constant change. We come to see something about the interdependent nature of things, that whatever there is may seem to appear in a certain way in the moment, but with just small changes in causes and conditions, things become very different. He actually begins, Trungpa Rinpoche does, by talking about the illusory nature of ego. Maybe illusory might be an easier word to swallow than non-existent. But we realize that who we are, how we feel, what we see, what we think is changing all the time, even over a matter of days, let alone if we go back years and years and think about how the world looked to us when we were children, or when we were adolescents, or when we were in college, or wherever we might be in life. And we come to see more and more that what seems solid and graspable is actually illusory, changing all the time. And it's these experiences that begin to give us some understanding of what shunyata, what emptiness is. And because we're so habituated to taking things to be real on the spot, it's something that we need to do again and again. That it's again something that we need to look into, look further, as Trungpa Rinpoche says. And again, that's the Vipassana Prajna piece, again and again. And just as a little bit of a blast from the past, we actually began talking about shunyata and emptiness way back when we read the Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva. And just to remind you of some verses from that book, here again we're talking about the training aspect of this. By training in this aptitude for emptiness, the habit to perceive real things will be relinquished. By training in the thought there isn't anything, this view itself will also be abandoned. So this verse is talking about the two extremes, taking things to be real, and then immediately going to the conceptual opposite and say, well, then nothing's real. And he says both of those need to be abandoned. We're going past the two extremes, which is also what Trungpa Rinpoche said in the chapter we read a few weeks back on talking about Madhyamika and Nagarjuna. There is nothing. When this is asserted, no thing is there to be examined. How can a nothing wholly unsupported rest before the mind as something present? And the idea here is that the idea of negation, that therefore if there isn't something real, then maybe nothing's real, just to go to the opposite extreme of nothing, that even the idea of nothing depends on the idea of there being something. So even that is interdependent. It doesn't exist on its own terms. It only exists in relation to something else. And again, the entire idea, this is very much like what John talked about in the chapter that he talked about, that notion of dizziness, that letting go with koans and so forth. This is exactly what Shantideva says. When something and its non-existence both are absent from before the mind, no other option does the latter have. It comes to perfect rest from concepts free. So this is the real letting go of both the extreme of eternalism, or taking things to be solid, real, fixed, and the opposite, to therefore say, well, then nothing's real, nothing matters, nothing really exists. And letting go of both is what actually allows us to wake up. So, just a little bit of a blast from the past. So, awakening unfabricated perception. One of the interesting things about this title, and one of the things again to contemplate, is that in fact, most of the time, and this was the point about Kuntak and Kunze that John talked about, is that we do fabricate perception. That we don't see things as they are. We see things in, colored by our hopes and fears, our passions and our aversions, and that we only at best have a very limited sense of things as they are. So how do we awaken unfabricated perception? And Trungpa Rinpoche begins by talking about viewing the world with loving kindness and compassion. And two really key sentences in understanding what he's talking about right in the beginning. When we begin to perceive the phenomenal world from the viewpoint of bodhicitta, in other words, from the viewpoint of awakened mind, we find something quite different from what we are samsarically accustomed to. Samsarically accustomed to means the ways in which we habitually perceive the world based on a belief in ego, belief in a dualistic sense of I and other, all of the things that obscure and cause us to solidify ourselves as real and a real outside world, as opposed to coming to see the world in a more non-dualistic manner. Instead, when we actually are able to perceive the phenomenal world from the viewpoint of bodhicitta, we begin to have an understanding of things as they are. Not things as we fear they are, things we hope they are, not things we wish they were, but just things as they are. Very simple and straightforward. And he says, when we perceive the world according to shunyata and Madhyamika logic, it's necessary to understand that our whole being, our basic essence, is connected with wakefulness. Our whole being, our basic essence, is connected with wakefulness. I remember hearing a teaching once where about Buddha nature, about this basic essence, our basic essence of wakefulness, is if we think about our awareness as if it's this little dot inside of us, but actually this is the other way around, that in fact awareness is vast, and this sense of ego, this sense of I and other that we have is in fact very tiny and exists within the much greater sphere of open awareness. It's just that we don't recognize it that way. In any case, to talk about how we awaken unfabricated perception, how we that's not, in other words, perception that's not created, that's not developed out of Kunzup and Kuntak, by having developed Maitri for ourselves, loving kindness to ourselves, and Karuna or compassion for others, the ground of our existence begins to thaw, and the samsaric world begins to flake. I like the idea of the samsaric world beginning to flake. Our ordinary habitual perceptions of things begin to come apart somewhat. We begin to see things in a different way because we allow ourselves to open up. That if we don't open ourselves, first of all, to ourselves with a sense of loving kindness, just a very basic acceptance, and if we're not able to open to the world, then this thawing won't happen. And he says that with this, that we realize that we have no grudge, or another way to put it is we have no struggle for or against. And with that, we can let go and open further. So compassion is a very important aspect of being able to open ourselves to unfabricated perception, to shunyata, as well as to being able to work in a compassionate way with others. Dzigar Kongtrul says that shunyata without compassion is just conceptual negation. So it's not, compassion is very much a part of the path at this point, very much a part of what we're cultivating and developing. And he says this quality of openness and gentleness, this compassion and maitri for ourselves, compassion for others, or karuna for others, is not naive because it's combined with prajna. And he says there's an interesting balance between letting go and prajna. With that, he talks again about the importance of prajna, developing our clear seeing, our superior seeing. He says prajna distinguishes between entities very clearly. It distinguishes between what is and what is not, but it doesn't promote or reject anything. It's just, again, our first perception, our first open perception of things. He says if we reject or want to propagate something, we no longer have prajna. We're caught up again in struggle, this against that, I against other, or I trying to control other, or however, whatever drama we might create in relation to other. He says with prajna, everything is even and equal. Because prajna sees each thing on its own terms. It's not this in relation to that, or this defined in relation to that, but sees clearly things as they are. And with this, he begins again talking about the phenomenal world. Remember, he began the chapter by talking about when we begin to perceive the phenomenal world from the viewpoint of bodhicitta. He says phenomenal world refers to whatever we see, hear, feel. It refers to whatever we relate with. And with this, he begins an extended discussion about relating to a cup of tea, which I thought was interesting because you could think of a cup of tea in terms of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's life in two ways. One is that he spent his first contact with the West. He spent a good deal of time in England, where tea and rituals around tea is a part of English culture, as I think most people know. But also he had tremendous respect for Japanese Zen. And in Zen, the tea ceremony is very much a meditative practice, meditation and action practice to develop mindfulness and awareness and how to relate to things and relate to the world in a clear, gentle, awake manner. So it's interesting that he talks about a cup of tea, and I just with both of those, just sort of kept that in the back of my mind, that both English culture and Japanese culture were of great interest to Trungpa Rinpoche. In any case, he says, when we see a cup of tea, emptiness does not mean that we don't see the cup, the tea or table or the food. Again, shunyata is not negation. Doesn't mean because we say things don't exist in the way that we ordinarily think they do, doesn't mean that they don't not exist, that there's nothing there. It's not a vacuum. And that in fact, getting into negation or nihilism is again just an example of yes-no thinking. And we're trying to, again, which is how conceptual mind works, fine on the relative level, necessary on a relative level, perhaps helpful at times on a relative level, but an obstacle to really understanding shunyata. He says if we would not see the cup, tea, table, food, and so on, we'd starve to death. So emptiness does not mean being above the whole thing so that we don't need to eat. It refers purely to our perception of the phenomenal world. And with that, he begins talking about the way in which a teacup might be looked at in a samsaric manner. He talks about being, overlay of tremendous seriousness. This would be fabricated perception, not seeing things as they are, but seeing things in terms of, again, our hopes and fears, our expectations and preconceptions. And he says this is based on the absence of karuna and maitri, based on the absence of compassion and loving kindness toward ourselves. And it's actually stupefying. He says some people take pleasure in a great cup of tea, regarding their cup of tea as real. But he says if we look closely, we realize that seeing our cup of tea from the samsara point of view is stupid and aggressive. So a cup of tea might not be the thing that we take to be real. I have know people who, for instance, see as very real their cars, and you can see it in their aggressive driving. For some people, it might be politics. For somebody else, it might be money or whatever it is. But again, there's an overlay on top of the thing itself, and that this makes us, as he says, stupid and aggressive. But we'll go back to the metaphor of a cup of tea. If we examine the process of drinking a cup of tea precisely and thoroughly from Prajna's point of view, we see how our mind perceives the act of drinking a cup of tea. In other words, we're aware of what we're aware of. There's a knowing quality to Prajna. It's not, we know what's in our minds. We see clearly how we're relating to things. In a very simple, direct way. We see how our mind perceives the act of drinking a cup of tea from the very beginning. We see how we order it, how we first perceive it, how we go through the process of waiting for it, sipping it, and finishing it, whether it comes with milk or honey. And again, this really, I think, reminded me of what I understand of the Japanese tea ceremony, which is really a moment-to-moment, very precise, awake experience of shamatha vipassana in regard to preparing and serving a cup of tea. In that it's done with awareness. It's a practice of awareness and a practice of really recognizing what's in our mind and how we're relating to the world, which is exactly what he said. The phenomenal world refers to whatever we see, hear, feel. It's whatever we relate with. So this is and it's this clarity, this ability to just simply see things in a very simple and direct way, that arises out of some feeling of compassion and loving kindness, acceptance of ourselves as we are, acceptance and being in the world as it is, without trying to make things different, without imposing any kind of preconception or label or concept of things. It's a very direct experience in a very simple way of shunyata. The next section is titled Applying the Teachings of Shunyata. And he says that shunyata is the perspective that arises when we relate to the world purely on the level of perception. When we see table as table, book as book, without anything imposed on them other than what's absolutely the bare minimum necessary. He says shunyata isn't some great understanding or revelation. In other words, it's not extraordinary, external to what we're experiencing, but it's just simply seeing things as they are, which he says also means seeing things as they're not. In other words, we're seeing things as they're not. We don't lay onto them the random labels, the concepts, the preconceptions, expectations, all of the things that, again, are, as he said, the seriousness with which we might view a teacup, as opposed to just being able to simply be there and enjoy a cup of tea. He says if we don't see things as they are, they become overwhelming, a big deal. And that big deal quality of our perception is considered a veil that prevents us from relating with reality properly, a veil that makes us numb and unable to relate with the phenomenal world in its own right. So here again, when he's using the word veil, he's referring, in the traditional teachings, it said there are two veils. One is the veil of conflicting emotions, or the kleshas, that's largely dealt with through the Hinayana teachings, developed the discipline of shamatha vipassana, and beginning to be able to recognize and let go of kleshas. But the other is a veil of cognitive obscurations. It's exactly what we talked about in terms of kunzap and kuntag. It's all the labels and ideas that we impose on things, starting with the idea that we exist as an ego, that when we fail to see the illusory nature of holding on to a self. So again, here, what he's talking about overcoming in terms of seeing things as they are, is not imposing seriousness on things, not imposing a sense of fixing things in time as if they were permanent and unchanging, as if they were independent, as opposed to going through constant change, some of which might be apparent to us, some of which aren't. I was thinking about that when I was preparing, because I have a table in front of me that the computer's on, and we've owned this table for 40 years, and in one sense, yeah, I could say it's the same table that we bought 40 years ago, but in some ways it's not. It has some nicks and scratches that it didn't have before. And at one time it wasn't a table at all. It was a tree, or maybe a few trees. And at some point it was something before that. And in the future, who knows? We may give it away, it may get broken, it might rot, it might be used as firewood. It's not fixed that this will forever be what it is, how it appears to me right now. And that's true of every single thing in the world around us. That things are in a constant process of flux or change, which is what he's going to get to next. Ordinarily, a word such as tableness has a quality of holding on or fixation. Again, we fix it as this one real thing that is unchanging and that is, again, independent and singular. And he says if we take away that veil, the concept, the label, and actually see what's in front of us, we begin to see things truly and precisely as they are. He says we see them without their ness quality, without tableness. Interestingly enough, he then uses a ness word. The term for that is isness, which he also says is ta-ta-ta, or truth, or dharmaness, or dharmata. I think the difference is that isness is actually a verb and not a thing. That we're talking about its being and the fact that it's constantly changing. And it's, and again, it points to the changing nature of things, isness, but we can't really grasp it and say that it's any one thing that's pinpointable. And this is what he means. He says isness in this sense is empty. We begin to see reality at a very direct and personal level. Table is table because it's a table. And he says we can carry that understanding to a larger cosmic level. In other words, everything we experience, every phenomena we experience has a quality of emptiness, the absence of thingness. We begin to see things very clearly, precisely, and fantastically vividly because we no longer lay conceptual interpretations on them. This is what he's saying. We see things as they are, directly and simply. This is called the discovery of unconditional truth. It is self-existent truth. So it's not a truth that we lay on it, but it's truth that's already inherent in the nature of things. It's inherently true that things are in a constant process of change. It's inherently true that things don't have their independent existence, but depend on causes and conditions to come together. If the tree hadn't grown, if somebody hadn't cut down the tree, if somebody hadn't shaped the tree, I wouldn't have this table in front of me. So it took all of that. He says, with an understanding of spaciousness and precision, developed through the realization of things as they are in their own way, we begin to develop real heart and a sense of appreciation because we see things as they are. We're not just randomly labeling things and seeing this table, that table, as some kind of vague concept, but we're actually seeing the thing itself. And so there is some sense of real heart and real appreciation. It's interesting he uses the word spaciousness and precision, and again, it's one of his uses of words that we could contemplate. We could think of spaciousness and precision as referring to shamatha vipassana, or I guess more directly vipassana shamatha, since I tend to think of vipassana as more associated with spaciousness and precision more with shamatha. Or we could think of it in terms of what he talked about earlier, in terms of the process of both prajna and letting go. The prajna is the precision, and letting go is not holding on to anything. Spaciousness and precision. In any case, he goes on to say that shunyata experience doesn't mean we're disillusioned with this world and that we couldn't care less. There again, that would be just going from taking things as real to going to the opposite extreme. Just, trying to do some kind of conceptual flip, conceptual negation. He says we simply see that things have no inherent substance. And at the same time, we realize the reason we can see this, the reason that we're capable of perceiving this, even if it's only in glimpses, in meditation practice or in our post-meditation experience, but the reason we can see this is because we have some kind of continuing strength in our system all the time. And he says that strength or inquisitiveness, again, inquisitiveness, looking further, looking into, really, looking at being in our experience. That strength or inquisitiveness is known as Tathagata Garbha or Buddha nature, which brings us right back to that sentence in the beginning. Our basic essence is connected with wakefulness. And which is why I think the chapter is called Awakening, Unfabricated Perception. That we don't need to create anything. We just need to allow ourselves to be open to it. We need allow ourselves to open to what we already have, but just don't recognize. With this, we begin to appreciate things more because we're not using concepts. Using concepts, he says, is like putting price tags on things. That when we look at things without such barriers or blockages, we begin to become more inquisitive and clear. And we become even more eager and realize there's more work to do. And with this, the next section is titled Mingling Your Whole Being with Dharma. And he says the point of applying teachings of emptiness and compassion to our everyday life is to make the Dharma real as opposed to fantasy, to make the Dharma as individual and personal as possible. In other words, begin to increasingly see that the Dharma is not something external to us. This is, one of those points of a real switch of allegiance that we've sometimes talked about. But we realize that it's actually true, that it's right at the heart of our experience. He says we need to give in to the teachings, that if we don't understand a topic, we shouldn't think of ourselves as stupid, but rather see that we're not letting go or giving up enough, that we're somehow caught up in a point of view that's limiting our ability to understand and perceive. And with this, he says, there has to be a mingling of our whole being with the Dharma. Otherwise, the Dharma becomes an alien entity, becomes some kind of ego enhancement, or we solidify it as some kind of project. And again, we end up caught up in some kind of struggle with ourselves, rather than being able to relate to ourselves with Maitri and with the world with compassion. He says the Dharma is not too technical. We become technical. In other words, we see it as something external that we have to impose on ourselves, instead of just recognizing that it's actually true in our experience. And that Shunyata is not theorizing about how unreal or real our eye or nose might be. It's not theorizing at all. That Shunyata is based on personal experience and how we experience things. So that more and more, as we come to recognize something about Shunyata, we come to realize that it just is true, and that it is true to our experience, that we can and do experience these things. It was interesting, not theorizing about how real or unreal your eye or nose is, because it's obvious. I think he's referring back to the Heart Sutra. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body. But that's not the point. But the point is that we've run out of tricks. We've run out of our deviousness. And when we're affected by Shunyata principle, we realize we cannot con anything. So we begin to relax, open, and thaw. This is like what he said before about that there are moments when we run out of ammo, if you remember that chapter. And again, it's a possibility of just allowing ourselves to be open. And he says this living in this way is very simple. We feel that our stronghold, our ego, is useless and futile, that there's no reason to hold on to it anymore, that it's a question of surrendering rather than aspiring to the Dharma in a theistic way. And he says with this, and here again, another example perhaps of what it means to say there's a switch of allegiance. He talks about the difference between nostalgia for the past, and instead said we can have nostalgia for the present rather than the past. That nostalgia can become not a memory of the past, but a way of being where we are right now. He also talked about prajna at one point as having a haunting quality. And it just comes to us during the day. We kind of remember, just as it does during meditation practice, we drift and we get lost in thoughts. Then we realize, I'm thinking, and come back. The same thing begins to happen to us in daily life. And that we have these moments when we just wake up. That we can have a nostalgia for actually being present. A memory can actually work to bring us back. He says if we actually exert ourselves and discipline ourselves, we'll begin to see Shunyata, that Shunyata is very personal, and that we might feel our territory or privacy is being invaded, but we should go beyond that and let our privacy be invaded. We should let ourselves open up. We should let ourselves let go. And here again, this is why a sense of compassion toward the world and loving kindness to ourselves is an important part of being able to let go and open up, because we're able to do so without getting caught up in ordinary struggles that we do with ourselves and with the world around us. He says we should let our personality be condemned. We're talking here about letting go of a fixed sense of ego. We should let our personality be condemned, let go of expectation, let go of preconception, let go of our habitual ways of doing things, so that we begin to dissolve into the sea of Shunyata, which he says is peaceful, natural, and ordinary. And with this, he talks a little bit about his accident in England, but basically that experiences could be a celebration of life, even difficult and painful experiences. He says that shunyata means that we don't need the reference point of some solid entity in relating with the world. We don't need the reference point of some solid entity in relating with our friends, our food, our clothing, our world, that we can just open up. We could have no personal territory, no personal gain, no actual personal entity, it's again the sense of ego, that provokes our existence or the notion of our existence. And with this, he says, we still are, he says, you still are what you are, but you is not what you are. You is not. You don't exist, therefore you exist so much. Because we're just simply present, and we're simply aware, and we're simply available to the world around us, and we're available to our experience, and we're able to just be with ourselves and be with the world as it is. And he says, because we have given so much territory away, we can actually work with others. So the chapter ends with a discussion of the 7 riches of supreme beings. And I think those are pretty straightforward. I'm not going to say too much about them. Just not being distracted by sense experiences, so we're not as swayed by simple experiences. That we develop a diligent practice, that we have a sense of joy and faith, generosity, a sense of composure or modesty, and reasonableness in working with others. And then finally, that we develop clear knowledge or prajna, and that those are the riches, which he says can be are mundane, but there's a link between the two, because the more we begin to see non-existence, the more chance we have to relate to existence. And that the basic principle of Mahayana altogether is that bodhisattvas are supposed to save sentient beings rather than make a nuisance of themselves. So the 7 riches, beginning with not being distracted by sense perceptions, through composure, modesty, reasonableness, knowledge, and prajna, all those, that they're jewels of conduct. They're showing how we can handle ourselves in any activity we do. So they're worth, we reflect on them in that way. In some ways, they connect very directly, I think, with the 6 paramitas, which is also how we develop prajna. I'll say that also that this particular talk, Awakening Unfabricated Perception, is part of a talk that was titled the 5 bhumi, the first 5 bhumis. And the very first bhumi, very joyous, is the beginning of the path of seeing, if we divide teachings up in that way. And it's the path of seeing, this first bhumi, where a bodhisattva has the first real understanding, real perception, real experience of shunyata, and that it's marked by a real change in perception, a real change in allegiance. And it's just the first bhumi, the first stage in the development of bodhisattva. But as I said, in terms of understand something about shunyata, I think this is the most fruitional chapter in this section. And it really is, from a traditional Mahayana point of view, the real beginning of the Mahayana path of developing into full bodhisattvahood. So with that, I think I'll stop. We have a few minutes if there's any questions or comments. We've covered quite a bit of ground.
So you talked about essentially the sequence of shamatha, vipassana. I'm sorry. Shamatha, vipassana, prajna, and then shunyata, I guess sequentially. So then, are there further breakdowns shunyata moving forward. And I'm just curious, is there a continuing sequence that we haven't learned about, or? Yeah, that's my question.
Well, there's a deepening of shunyata. Again, there are a lot of the teachings are broken down in a lot of different ways. I think most commonly we've talked about Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana as three broad categories. Sometimes they're broken down in terms of three turnings of the wheel. In terms of Mahayana teachings, there are 10 bhumis, and the path of, and there are 5 paths, but the path of seeing really is just with this first bhumi, and then the remaining, well, not all of them, I think all until the 10th bhumi, I think, are the path of meditation, and they really involve a deepening of shunyata.
There are also discoveries that are made at different points. There are sticking points on this path of the 10 bhumis. So for instance, a difficult, what's the word? A difficult transition to get through is the very first bhumi. Pramudita means great joy. And it's the real discovery of shunyata and the entrance into the bodhisattva path. And it's the real discovery of true egolessness. But there's still, and he talked about footprints in that first chapter, there's still a watcher. That's what the footprints are, is the watcher, appreciating the progress. And this has to fall away. And it does continuously through all the bhumis.
Mm.
And they culminate, really, the first section of the bhumis in the 6th bhumi, which is the development, full-blown development of prajna, true transcendent seeing of egolessness, of self and egolessness, of dharmas, the whole thing. And then that's the 6th bhumi, and then the 7th bhumi is actually another very difficult one, a sticking point. This is the development of what's called upaya in Sanskrit, tap in Tibetan. And what it means is skillful means. And the idea here is that the bodhisattva, you see, is letting go of self, right? And letting go of the watcher. The watcher is getting thinner and thinner. And he's coming more, she, into the present moment. But there's still this trace of watcher saying, oh yeah, now I'm doing it, now I'm not, I'm making progress. And that impedes your knowledge. It's like when you're self-conscious, you don't move fluidly, right? You move jerkily. You're awkward. And the bodhisattva up to the 6th bhumi has too much watcher. And then there's this breakthrough after the 6th bhumi into the 7th, when the watcher really starts to disappear. And then the bodhisattva becomes much more skillful, much more able to relate to the phenomenal world and people and things around him or her. And this is the development of skillful means, upaya, the 7th bhumi. And then there's a progression again through the 8th, 9th, and another sticking point at the 10th bhumi. Again, because of the subtle, increasingly subtle, but still present watcher. Looking at one's progress on the path. And at the level of the 10th bhumi, which is the bhumi, the transcendent virtue there, is what's called power, bala. And the bodhisattva realizes, has the feeling that she is about to achieve enlightenment, but something is holding them back. They're sort of stuck. And then they realize what it is. What's holding them back? What's holding them back is the desire for enlightenment, the self-consciousness of it itself. And with that, snap, they are propelled into the state of Vajra-like samadhi, it's called, which is another name for enlightenment, the 11th bhumi, the 11th stage of the path, which is the Bodhisattva path is the 10 bhumis, the 11th is beyond it. And that's enlightenment itself. And what propels them into that is the sudden realization that they are being self-conscious, that they are watching themselves. It's the last real trace of ego. So there are all these different stages on the Bodhisattva path, but it all begins with the discovery of emptiness, of absolute truth and relative truth. It happens at the very level of the first bhumi, which is called.
But so is it in terms of the bhumis? I know we're laying it out sequentially, but is it really more like a continuing interplay between the bhumis, bouncing back, progress, 2 steps forward, 1 step back? I mean, is it dynamic like that, or is it supposed to be sequential, moving through without any return to previous bhumis?
I think it's my understanding. I can know, Michael, you tell me I'm wrong. Is that it's sequential, mostly. I mean, I'm sure you have intimations of what's coming, and you can see it, but then you actually realize it. And each bhumi is connected with a virtue. So the first, a transcendent virtue, a paramita. So the first bhumi, the discovery of emptiness, suddenly you are enabled to be very generous because there's no me. You're discovering that, the whole idea of me and mine was a myth, a falsity. And so you can afford to be very generous. So the first paramita is dana, generosity. And it goes like that. I think, what is the second? Is it, is it discipline?
Discipline.
Discipline.
But yeah, but we're getting late, so I'll just say that I think there are, from what I understand, I think it's like what John said, that in one sense it's sequential, in another sense there are moments when we might have experiences, but what really, stabilizing those experiences, that's the real realization, so that they're not just temporary experiences, but that they become something that you have complete confidence in. So in one sense, yes, you could have flashes of experience. We do, but what what really makes it stick is that at some point it becomes stabilized.
I tend to think that they really can't be sequential, because that would imply that there was a goal, that you've reached a certain level, and then there's something more that you can aspire to. And isn't that inconsistent with everything we've been studying and saying?
That's also true if we approach it in a conceptual way, yes. And then it does become an obstacle. But I guess we should stop. So I'll put up the closing chants on. Yes. Okay.
And we'll have discussion tomorrow. That was a great question, Ed. Great comment.
Okay, we'll close with a prayer for peace and with the dedication of merit generated by our practice and study for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
John.
everybody.
Thank you
Oh,
very much.
thank you, John. Thank
Michael,
you,
thank you,
Michael.
John.
Thank you all, yes.
Good night.
Good night.
Night, everybody.